He built a shelter in the forest to hide from the world. But when he returned a year later, there was a hatch under his house that hadn't been there before. What he saw inside shocked even the police. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The air was heavy with the scent of thawing earth and pine needles as Elias followed the half-vanished trail through the forest. Patches of old snow clung stubbornly to the shaded roots, but most of it had melted, leaving a patchwork of mud, moss, and brittle leaves beneath his boots. The sky was pale and distant, its color caught somewhere between gray and silver, and the low clouds drifted lazily above the treetops. Each breath he drew came out as a faint cloud in the cold morning air. It had been nearly a year since he last walked this path, a year filled with the dull repetition of city life, sleepless nights, and a growing sense of restlessness that nothing seemed to cure. He had told himself that returning to the place he once built with his own hands was only to clear his thoughts, but deep down he knew it was something else. It was about reclaiming something he had lost. The trail wound upward, tracing the side of a shallow hill. Beneath the frost-hardened soil, Elias could feel the familiar firmness of rock through the soles of his boots. He adjusted the strap of his rucksack and kept walking. Inside were only the things he needed most: a small stove, a knife, a steel mug, a flashlight, and a folded tarp. The forest seemed quieter than he remembered. Even the birds had fallen silent, their calls replaced by the soft whisper of wind through the bare branches. The world around him felt like it was holding its breath. When he finally reached the clearing, he stopped and stood still for a long time, letting his eyes travel across the familiar outline of the place that had once been his refuge. The giant rock slab his roof, his shelter leaned outward from the hillside like the brim of a colossal stone hat. Beneath it, the small log structure he had built years ago still stood, weathered but solid. Moss covered most of the rock's surface, bright and green despite the cold, and thin tendrils of moisture dripped down like threads of glass. For a moment, Elias felt a quiet swell of pride. He remembered how this had all begun, how lost he had been, and how the act of building something real with his hands had pulled him back to life. He walked closer. At first glance, everything looked the same: the uneven walls of logs, the low entrance, the flat patch of ground before it, where he used to build his fires. But as he stepped nearer, the details began to unsettle him. The moss at the edge of the slab was disturbed, as if someone had climbed over it recently. A few logs had shifted, and one near the bottom was newer, lighter in color, less weathered than the rest. He crouched, running his fingers along it. The wood was smooth, recently cut, and smelled faintly of resin. Inside, the air was dry and cool. Dust clung to the edges of the rough wooden shelves, and his old mug sat exactly where he had left it. But on the small table he had built from split planks lay an empty tin can and a short piece of copper wire. They were out of place. Elias froze, scanning the shadows. Someone had been here. The realization came slowly but settled deep inside him like a stone in cold water. He stepped outside again, listening to the forest, but heard only the wind brushing through the branches. He walked around the shelter, his boots crunching softly on the thin crust of snow. Years ago, when he first built it, the surrounding ground had been flat and untouched, the soil compacted only by his own steps. Now he noticed faint impressions near the back, barely visible. But there, boot prints, large ones, heading toward the slope where the ground met the massive rock. He crouched again, brushing away a layer of frozen leaves. The prints were days old, perhaps even less. Whoever had come here knew exactly where to step to remain unnoticed. He straightened and looked up at the rock itself. The surface was streaked with moisture, the moss glistening in the dim light. He ran his hand over the rough edge and felt the steady, reassuring chill of the stone. This place had once been a symbol of solitude for him. After the divorce, when he could no longer bear the noise of the city, he had come here, carrying little more than tools and desperation. He had found this enormous slab by accident while following a stream. The rock jutted out from the hillside in such a perfect way that it seemed nature had designed it to shelter someone. Over weeks, he had gathered fallen trunks, cut them to size, and fitted them together into crude walls. His hands had blistered and bled, but with each log, each strike of the axe, something inside him had started to mend. He could still remember that first night when the rain came down in sheets, hammering against the stone above him. He had sat beneath it, a small fire crackling beside him, his clothes damp, his hands shaking. But for the first time in months, he had felt a kind of peace. This place had given him back a sense of purpose. Now, standing before it again, he felt that same quiet presence, but it was tainted by unease. He sat on a fallen log near the entrance and unhooked his flask, taking a sip of cold water. The taste of metal and pine filled his mouth. His eyes wandered across the ground, tracing the curve of the stone where it met the earth. Something there caught his attention, a slight rise in the soil, a mound that had not been there before. He frowned, set the flask aside, and knelt beside it. The surface was covered with moss and a thin layer of melting snow. He brushed it away with his gloved hand and saw a dull metallic glimmer beneath. His pulse quickened. Carefully, he took out his knife and scraped away more of the earth until a round edge began to emerge. It wasn't a rock. It was metal smooth, cold, and circular. As he cleared more of it, the outline of what looked unmistakably like a hatch appeared before him. The edges were clean, the hinges intact, and the handle slightly rusted, but functional. He stared at it, feeling a slow, heavy realization spread through him. Someone had installed this. He sat back on his heels, breathing steadily. He ran his fingers along the rim. The metal was modern, too well made to be old debris from the war or an abandoned storage tank. The hinges had been greased recently. A faint smear of oil shone where the sunlight touched them. It made no sense. Who would come all the way into the forest to build something like this, right beneath his shelter? Elias pushed against the handle, testing its strength, but it didn't move. It was locked or sealed from within. The hollow sound that echoed back confirmed there was space beneath it. He stood up and looked around, half expecting to see someone watching from the trees, but the forest was still and silent. That night, he built a small fire just outside the shelter. The flames flickered against the rock, painting it in warm, uneven light. He sat there for hours, staring into the fire, trying to make sense of it. The logical part of his mind offered explanations. Maybe it was some kind of geological survey or an old military outpost. The authorities had been known to use remote locations for underground storage, but the freshness of the hinges, the boot prints, and the new log in his wall told another story. Someone had been here recently, and whoever it was had gone to great lengths to conceal their presence. He thought about the city, about how quickly people learned to ignore what they didn't understand. Maybe this was no different. Maybe he should ignore it too. But this was his place, his refuge, and the idea of someone else using it for unknown purposes stirred something fierce in him, a quiet anger, mixed with fear and a strange sense of violation. The fire burned low. He added another log, listening to the crackle and pop of the wood. The sound echoed faintly against the stone roof. He wrapped his jacket tighter around himself. The night air was cold enough to sting his lungs, but he didn't want to sleep. His eyes kept drifting to the dark outline of the mound where the hatch lay hidden. In the stillness, the forest felt heavier than usual, as if holding secrets beneath its frozen soil. When he finally closed his eyes, exhaustion pulled him down into a restless sleep. In his dreams, he heard the sound of footsteps above him, slow and deliberate, and the metallic clang of something being shut tight. He woke just before dawn, his heart pounding, unsure whether the sound had been real or only in his head. The fire had gone out, and a thin layer of frost covered the ground. He rubbed his hands together, staring at the pale light creeping over the treetops. The hatch was still there, buried under moss and silence, waiting. Elias knew then that he couldn't leave it alone. Something had changed beneath the stone he once trusted. The forest that had always given him peace now whispered a different message, a quiet warning, or perhaps a call. Either way, he understood one thing. He had to know what was beneath his refuge. And so, as the first rays of sun filtered through the trees, he stood, brushed the snow from his jacket, and prepared himself to stay longer than he had planned. He didn't yet realize that what waited beneath the ground would not only test his courage, but also force him to face what solitude had taught him to avoid the intrusion of others and the fragile boundary between safety and truth. The forest, as always, kept its silence, but the air around him carried the faintest tremor, like a breath drawn and held, waiting for something to begin. Morning came quietly, with the slow and patient rhythm that belonged only to the forest. The air was sharp enough to sting his lungs, and the faint sunlight bled through the treetops like diluted gold. Elias woke with the uneasy weight of half-remembered dreams, the kind that clung to the back of the mind long after waking. The fire had long since died, leaving only a gray ring of ash and the faintest curl of smoke. For a while, he sat in silence, rubbing warmth into his hands, staring at the ground near the hatch where frost had formed again overnight. It looked harmless in daylight, an unassuming circle of metal nestled among roots and moss. Yet the thought of it made his stomach tighten. He boiled water on the small stove, the hiss of the flame breaking the stillness. The rising steam mixed with his breath as he sipped his coffee and studied the clearing. The light snowfall from the night before had softened everything, covering the boot prints he had seen, but not enough to erase them entirely. Beneath the fresh layer, faint depressions curved around the side of the shelter, as though someone had walked there recently and lightly dusted the ground afterward. The precision of it unsettled him. It wasn't the work of a careless traveler. Whoever came here knew how to cover their tracks. He stood, walked the perimeter, and noticed something else. A line of compressed snow leading toward the trees. It wasn't deep enough to be footprints. The marks were smooth and parallel, the kind left by narrow tires. He crouched down and brushed away the powder. Beneath it, the dirt was darker, wetter. Tracks of a small vehicle, perhaps an ATV or a compact truck. His mind replayed the sound he had imagined the night before, the distant growl of an engine echoing through the trees. It hadn't been a dream after all. Elias followed the trail for a few dozen meters before it disappeared into a patch of thicker snow. Nearby, glinting in the pale light, lay a scrap of torn plastic half buried near a log. He picked it up and turned it over. The piece bore a printed logo, an industrial one, cleanly designed, and under it faded text that read, Geo Drill Industries. He frowned. He had never heard of the company, but the name alone stirred a dull alarm. Geological drilling. Extraction. The thought of heavy equipment operating beneath the forest soil made something twist inside him. He folded the scrap and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Back at the shelter, he stared again at the hatch. The air around it was a little different colder, as if the metal beneath the ground breathed its own temperature. He knelt and cleared the snow away with his gloved hands, tracing the edge until the circular plate was fully visible. It was smooth and well-fitted, its hinges secured with thick bolts. He gripped the handle and pulled, but it didn't move. He tried again, bracing his boots against the rock, but the metal refused to yield. He rose, caught his breath, then looked around for leverage. Near the fire pit, he found a piece of wood, a broken branch thick enough to serve as a makeshift pry bar. He wedged it beneath the edge and pressed down with all his weight. The hatch groaned once, a low, reluctant sound, then shifted slightly. Cold air rushed upward, brushing against his face. The smell hit him next. Oil, metal, and something faintly chemical. He crouched low and pointed his flashlight into the opening. What the beam revealed made him shiver. Beneath the hatch, a narrow vertical shaft dropped straight down. Metal rungs were fixed to one side, their edges gleaming faintly. The walls weren't dirt, but concrete, lined smooth and recent. The beam of the flashlight extended perhaps 10 feet before it was swallowed by darkness. He moved the light around slowly. The lower edge of the opening was dry, clean, untouched by the decay of time. Whoever built this had done it recently. And with precision. Elias shut the flashlight off and sat back. The sound of his own breathing seemed too loud. He didn't know what unnerved him more, the thought that someone had constructed something under his refuge, or that he might not be supposed to know it existed. The forest suddenly felt different, smaller, as though the earth beneath him wasn't his anymore. He sat for a long time beside the hatch, unsure of what to do. It crossed his mind that he could call someone, report it anonymously, perhaps. But what would he even say? That he'd found a door in the woods? That his private shelter might sit on top of someone's hidden operation? The thought felt absurd. The authorities would laugh, or worse, think he was imagining things. He stood and paced slowly around the clearing, each step sinking lightly into the damp snow. The forest gave no answers, only the quiet rhythm of dripping water from the branches, the sigh of a wind rising somewhere far off. He stopped, took a deep breath, and turned back to the hatch. A decision formed, as slow and heavy as the clouds overhead. He couldn't walk away. The thought of someone using his sanctuary for something secret, something illegal, was unbearable. This place had been built with his hands, his effort, his solitude. He had claimed it from the wilderness. No stranger had the right to change what it meant. He crouched again and tested the hatch once more, but the hinges refused to move further. He decided against forcing it completely open. If someone returned, they'd know he'd been there. Instead, he picked up his phone and took several photographs. The hatch, the disturbed snow, the tire tracks, and the torn plastic packaging. He moved a few meters away and took another shot from a wider angle, capturing the position of the shelter beneath the stone slab. Each picture felt like a small act of defiance, a record of intrusion. As the day wore on, the clouds thickened, and a faint snow began to fall again. Elias set up his small stove and made tea, then sat by the fire, the camera resting beside him. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. He told himself he'd leave in the morning, hike to the nearest ranger station, and ask for help discreetly. Yet as night approached, that resolution began to fade. The forest didn't feel empty anymore. It felt watched. When the darkness fell fully, it came fast. The fire cast long, trembling shadows across the clearing. Every sound seemed amplified. The cracking of ice in the nearby stream, the rustle of branches, the far-off groan of trees shifting in the wind. Elias sat with his back against the rock, one hand near the flashlight, the other resting on the hilt of his knife. He tried to convince himself he was being paranoid, that his nerves were playing tricks after too many nights alone. But deep down, he knew better. It started as a faint hum, so distant he almost missed it. A low mechanical murmur that rolled through the ground, more than through the air. Then, gradually, it grew clearer. The sound of an engine, Not a plane, not a distant truck, but something moving closer. His pulse quickened. He reached for the flashlight, but didn't turn it on. The noise grew louder, then slowed, as if whoever it was had found the clearing. Elias crouched low behind a thick tree trunk, the darkness wrapping around him like a second skin. A minute later, beams of light cut through the trees, 2 flashlights, moving steadily, their glow catching the edges of branches and snowflakes. 2 figures stepped into view, their silhouettes tall and bundled in dark winter jackets. One of them carried something heavy, a case of some sort. The other had a tool slung over his shoulder. They didn't speak. He held his breath as they approached the hatch. One of the men knelt, brushed the snow aside, and twisted something metallic. The lid opened silently. They moved with the ease of routine. A narrow beam of light shot upward from below as one of them descended. The other waited, scanning the tree line with a flashlight that swept dangerously close to where Elias crouched. His fingers gripped the bark until they hurt. The beam passed over him once, then turned away. A few minutes later, the second man descended. The hatch closed with a hollow thud, and the clearing fell into darkness again. The faint mechanical hum resumed, this time from below. Elias remained still for a long time, long after the last trace of light vanished. The forest returned to its silence, but now that silence felt heavier, thick with secrets. When he finally dared to move, he approached the hatch again. The snow was freshly disturbed, the footprints clear under the faint starlight. The metal handle glistened where it had been touched. He crouched, felt the cold air seeping up from the cracks, and for the first time, he knew with certainty that there was more than empty space beneath him. There were people down there, working, hiding, building something that didn't belong. He returned to his fire, though the warmth did little to ease the tension that had settled into his body. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat upright, listening to the forest breathe. Every sound seemed sharper now, the whisper of wind, the far-off hoot of an owl, even the creak of his own shelter as it shifted against the rock. When dawn came again, it found him awake, exhausted, but clear-headed. The forest lay still under a thin veil of snow, the hatch sealed as though nothing had happened. He walked over and stood above it, the air steaming faintly from his breath. The decision he'd been postponing now felt inevitable. If he walked away, the mystery would follow him forever. If he stayed, at least he could uncover the truth. He tightened the straps on his pack, glanced once more toward the tree line, and whispered to himself, "Today." The word sounded strange in the cold air, small but final. Then he knelt and began to clear the hatch again, brushing away the frost with careful, deliberate movements. He knew the risk. But curiosity, mixed with anger, and the need for closure, outweighed everything else. Somewhere deep beneath his feet, he imagined the faint echo of machinery. It pulsed through the ground, rhythmic and alive. Whatever was hidden there had been built with purpose. And Elias, standing alone beneath the watchful silence of the trees, resolved to find out what that purpose was. The forest was frozen in its own silence when Elias returned to the hatch the next morning. The faint snow from the night before had hardened into a thin crust that cracked softly under his boots. The air was colder than it had been in days, sharp and unmoving, as if the world had paused in anticipation. He stood over the metal circle embedded in the earth and watched his breath rise like smoke. There was no sound from below now, no hum, no sign of life, but that only made him more uneasy. He ran his hand across the hatch, clearing the frost. The metal was freezing to the touch, but the sight of it filled him with something between curiosity and anger. This was his place, his sanctuary, and he no longer recognized it. Someone had built something secret under his refuge, turned his quiet corner of the world into a hiding place for something he didn't understand. He knew that walking away would mean living with the thought of it forever, an unanswered question gnawing at him until it became unbearable. So he decided that today he would go down. He packed his small flashlight, a rope, and his camera into his bag. He hesitated before slipping the knife into his belt. It wasn't a weapon. He'd used it countless times for cooking, cutting wood, fixing things, but somehow it felt like protection now. He knelt by the hatch and gripped the handle again. The hinge resisted for a moment, then gave way with a low creak that echoed through the clearing. The smell of cold metal and oil rushed upward. Elias took a breath that trembled slightly, hooked the rope to the trunk of a nearby tree, and began his descent. The metal rungs were slick with moisture, and each step downward sent faint vibrations through the narrow shaft. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing smooth concrete walls that looked too new to belong to this old forest. He counted the rungs as he descended, 10, 20, 30, until his boots touched solid ground. The air below was cold, heavy, and damp. A tunnel stretched before him, the walls smooth and gray, with faint streaks of condensation glistening where the light caught them. He moved forward carefully, his footsteps echoing softly. The tunnel curved slightly, narrowing at one point before widening again. Every sound felt amplified in the confined space, the drip of water from the ceiling, the steady rhythm of his own breathing, the occasional hum of machinery that came and went like a pulse beneath the earth. He stopped once to listen, half expecting to hear voices, but there was only the sound of his heartbeat thudding in his ears. After several minutes, he reached a metal door slightly ajar. A faint glow leaked from within, a pale, bluish light that reminded him of hospital corridors. Elias hesitated, his hand on the doorframe. He thought of the two men he had seen the night before, the way they had moved with purpose, the silence between them. Whatever was inside wasn't abandoned. Someone had been here very recently. He pushed the door open slowly. The light came from a single lamp hanging above a small underground chamber. The space was larger than he expected, perhaps the size of a small garage. Metal crates were stacked along the walls, some open and filled with equipment he didn't recognize. Coiled cables, drill heads, sealed containers with warning labels. In the center stood a generator, quiet now, but still warm to the touch. On one of the crates lay a clipboard and a folded map. Elias approached, scanning everything carefully. The map was detailed, showing the surrounding region with markings in red ink circles, lines, and numbers that corresponded to coordinates. Some of the points stretched beyond the forest into nearby hills. At the top of the map was a company logo, the same one from the torn plastic he had found. Geo-Drill Industries. The notes beside it mentioned sample storage, test depth, and subsurface evaluation zone. He didn't understand all the technical jargon, but one phrase stood out in block letters. Unauthorized site keep confidential. He felt a slow, deliberate chill spread through him. This wasn't just an abandoned experiment or old military installation. This was active, illegal. They were drilling here, deep inside a protected forest, using the land as cover. He reached for his camera, took several photos of the map and crates, then moved toward the back of the room, where another small door led into a narrower passage. The deeper corridor was rougher, unfinished, with cables running along the walls and puddles of water reflecting the light of his flashlight. The air smelled faintly of fuel and damp stone. He walked until he reached a section that widened again into a smaller chamber. Inside were several metal boxes labeled Core Samples, North Ridge. He opened one and found cylindrical sections of rock, each carefully cut and numbered. Beneath them were sheets of paper listing mineral contents. Didn't take long for him to piece it together. They were searching for something valuable beneath the forest floor. He crouched, taking more photos. His hand shook slightly as he zoomed in on the company name stamped on the corner of one of the sheets. Restricted distribution, it read in small print. Elias closed the box and looked around. Every detail, the fresh footprints in the mud, the warm generator, the neat arrangement of crates, told him this operation was ongoing. He turned back toward the tunnel, ready to leave. That was when he heard it, a faint metallic clang from somewhere behind him, followed by the distant hum of machinery coming back to life. His stomach clenched. Someone had turned on the generator remotely. The air vibrated faintly, the sound of motors building somewhere deeper underground. Elias switched off his flashlight and pressed himself against the wall, holding his breath. Footsteps echoed faintly from the corridor he had just come through. He could hear voices now. 2 men speaking in low tones, their words indistinct, but hurried. He didn't need to understand them to know they were returning. He crouched low and moved toward the side of the room, slipping behind a stack of crates. The footsteps grew louder, then paused near the entrance. A beam of light swept through the chamber. "Power's running again," one of the voices said, sharp and impatient. "Check the samples. We're leaving tonight." Elias stayed perfectly still. He could see the shadows of the men as they crossed the room. One of them opened a crate, then another. The metallic clatter of lids and the scrape of tools echoed through the small space. His hands tightened around his camera, still warm from use. If they found him here, he didn't know what would happen. After several long minutes, the men left as abruptly as they had come. The sound of their boots faded, followed by the closing of the outer door. The generator hummed quietly again, but the rest of the underground world was still. Elias exhaled slowly, forcing his shaking hands to steady. He waited another few moments, then slipped out from behind the crates. He turned off the flashlight and followed the faint glow of emergency lights toward the exit. The climb back up the ladder felt endless. His fingers slipped twice on the wet rungs, and by the time he reached the top, his arms ached. He pushed the hatch open just enough to see the clearing. The forest above was empty, bathed in weak daylight. He pulled himself out, closed the hatch quietly, and stepped back, his breath ragged in the cold air. For a moment he simply stood there, listening to the wind, his mind spinning with what he had seen. Back at his shelter, he packed quickly, tucking the camera deep into his bag. The evidence was clear. Photos of crates, documents, the map, and the markings on the samples. He didn't waste another minute. By afternoon, he was on the trail heading back toward civilization. It took him hours to reach the first sign of a signal on his phone. He stopped on a rocky hill where the forest opened to the valley below. The bars flickered to life, and he called the local authorities. The first officer who answered sounded skeptical, his tone cautious and detached. But Elias insisted, describing everything in detail. The hidden hatch, the underground tunnels, the equipment. Eventually, they agreed to send someone to check. The next few days blurred together. The investigators found the hatch, the tunnels, the machinery. Most of the equipment was gone by the time they arrived. The operation cleared out in a hurry. But the evidence he had gathered, his photos and recordings, was enough to prove what had been happening. Geo-Drill Industries had been operating without permits, digging into protected land and using the dense forest as cover. The company was shut down pending investigation. Elias gave his statement, answered their questions, and watched as others walked through the place that had once belonged only to him. When it was all over, he left without looking back. Weeks later, spring came early. The snow melted, and the forest began to wake again. Elias returned to his shelter, carrying nothing but a small backpack and a quiet sense of finality. The clearing looked different. Now, emptier, cleaner. The hatch had been welded shut, the earth around it tamped flat and covered with a layer of new moss. Nature was already reclaiming what had been disturbed. He sat near the stone wall of his shelter, listening to the steady murmur of the wind through the trees. The air smelled of damp soil and pine. For the first time in months, the forest felt quiet again, honest in its silence. He built a small fire, watching the flames rise and dance against the stone. He thought about what had happened, how something as small as curiosity had led him to uncover a hidden network of greed beneath the earth. But more than that, he thought about what it meant to protect a place. The forest didn't belong to anyone, not really. But for a time, it had been his home. It had given him shelter when the rest of the world had nothing left to offer. Maybe, in return, it had asked for one thing, for him to listen when something wasn't right. As the fire burned low, Elias felt a calm settle over him. The ache that had driven him here years ago had softened. He had defended something that mattered, not just to him, but to the world beyond. When the embers dimmed and the shadows grew long, he stood and looked once more at the welded circle beneath the moss. The stone above him loomed as it always had, silent, immense, eternal. Beneath it, the forest had hidden secrets. But now, all that remained was peace. Elias smiled faintly, shouldered his pack, and walked into the trees, the sound of his footsteps fading into the quiet rhythm of the land he had protected. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Watch the other stories on the channel. Everyone carries something worth thinking about. And if this video moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.